Yes, go. Well, welcome everyone to our Corona Crisis live talks. I am happy that you all are watching, and it is my privilege to host the session today. I greet everyone who's watching on Facebook as well as on YouTube. And if you like, you can invite your friends to watch parties, to join us in your Facebook and as well as in your YouTube channels as you may be used to do so. I would like to introduce Vishal Mangalwadi, our major person whom we owe much of the existence of these talks to, because he is inspiring most of those who've been involved in setting this up. He is a social reformer and an internationally renowned author and speaker, author of 21 books, which have been translated into 14 languages like Korean, 6 Indian languages, Indonesian, Chinese, and 4 European languages. And the idea of our series of talks and discussions is to ask, what is God saying to us? We want to listen to experts, not just to opinions, but people who have studied and looked deeply into matters and the issues in various sections of society. And I would now like to ask Vishal to say a few words to us at the beginning of this third live talk. Please, Vishal. Oh.
Am I on? This last week, since we met, The Atlantic published an article by George Becker saying that America was already a failed state, and the coronavirus has exposed the depth of that failure. And yesterday it was interesting listening to a major commentator on Fox News resisting the idea that the crisis may be the start of the Chinese century, as the last 100 years or so have been the American century. So these talks are an attempt for us to look at the big picture, to listen to experts, to think and talk together in order to understand what is God saying through the crisis and through what has been happening. If the Western economies, which have been the dominant economies for the last 500 years, if the crisis is actually exposing their weaknesses, then what is it that we need to understand? And so I'm very grateful that Hans-Joachim Hahn, who is the founder of the Professors Forum in Germany, and Andreas Wieland and Prabhu Guptara have been helping us to organize and invite the thinkers and leaders, cutting-edge leaders, to lead us in these discussions through their presentations. We are loosely hosted by Revelation Movement and Truth Matters. These are two movements in the US and Europe, which are exploring truth, believing that God speaks to us and He is the Creator, is still speaking to us, including through this crisis, and we ought to listen carefully. So thank you again for joining us, and we will be meeting every Tuesday.
To introduce to you the 3 panelists, the 3 speakers today. At first, I would like to introduce Dr. Eve Poole. She is the 3rd Church Estate Commissioner for England and Chairman of the Board of Governors at Gordonston School in Scotland. She has a BA in Theology from Durham, an MBA from Edinburgh, and a PhD in Theology and Capitalism from Cambridge. Her most recent books are Leadersmithing, Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, and Buying God. She will be our first speaker, but I would like to introduce the other speakers as well. Eugen Hertel, Dr. Eugen Hertel, after his bachelor and master in economics, Eugen in theological content were taught by the Kirchliche Hochschule Wuppertal-Bessel in Germany, and the management perspective was mainly influenced by the University of St. Gall in Switzerland and the St. Gall management model. Also the basis for the keynote today. In the last decade, he has worked for startups and missions around the world. He has taught as a lecturer at various institutes and universities in Germany and abroad. His own consulting company, Start and Grow Consulting. Besides the classical strategic planning and growth consulting of large established companies, he focused on innovative technology stuff. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Sorry. Prabhu is retired and so works now as a board. Prabhu is our third speaker, and he now works as a board consultant and publisher, but was distinguished professor of global business management and public policy at William Carey University in India. He is also one of our hosts and a major contributor to these discussions. Now, for all of you who are listening, there is a possibility of participating by the chats. You can use the chats in Facebook or in YouTube. The questions will be selected and we will try to answer the most significant and strategic questions in the course of the discussion after the speakers have presented. If you don't like to go into the chat rooms or you cannot, you may also write an email to info@mangalwadi.de. That's another option to communicate your questions or comments that you might like to add. Well, let me now give the word to our first speaker, Dr. Eve Poole. Eve, why don't you share your exciting thoughts with us?
Thank you. About 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, as you've heard. And the book was an attempt to notice how some of the key design assumptions of capitalism have over time just become worn, past their sell-by date, and potentially cancerous to the system as a whole. In the context of the coronavirus, I'd like to reflect on how those assumptions are faring now, and also to make some observations about the shift there has been in the economy and how we might, as believers in God and Jesus, respond to that with God in mind. The first key assumption that underlies all thinking about free market economics, and capitalism in particular, is that of the invisible hand. That if we all just pursue our own interests, somehow the invisible hand will work behind the scenes towards the good. And unfortunately, the invisible hand has coronavirus. So all over the world, states are having to make unprecedented levels of intervention in order to rescue economies. I'm based in the UK, and here over a quarter of the workforce is now effectively employed by the government under the job retention scheme. About 52% of all current spending in the economy is being undertaken by the government. The invisible hand was always a myth that allowed the powerful to manipulate the market in their own interest, and coronavirus is just exposing that. Competition is another pivotal assumption. The idea that if we all, again, pursue our own interests, and allow competition by trying to be individually excellent and not talking to each other, not colluding as the antitrust laws would have it, then we get automatic improvement and benefit for the market. The problem is that the maths doesn't bear that out as a good strategy, and it particularly doesn't bear that out as a strategy in a disaster like COVID-19, where actually collaboration would be getting us better outcomes. Speaking from the UK, as the chairman, as you've heard, of Gordonstoun School, our sector has just had an official warning from the anti-competition authorities, from the pro-competition antitrust authorities, about price fixing and collusion, because we've had the temerity to talk to each other about the decisions that we have already made about fees. Which is really stupid, because actually these are not profit-making organisations, they are charities, and what we are trying to do is get the best education available to children online in an unprecedented crisis. So competition isn't working either. How about utility? The idea that with the invisible hand and with competition, automatically that produces the greatest good for the greatest number, and that if we all just pursue our own utility, then the Commonwealth will result. Utility thinking and utilitarianism as a governing ethic for a capitalist economy has been exposed as morally bankrupt, because so many states have been talking about herd immunity in the context of this virus. And that's the idea that you can willingly sacrifice the vulnerable in order to protect the majority. And as we've seen globally, that is unacceptable. And people are finding that their stomach is churning at the thought that that might be an ethic that would govern global humanity. Shareholder value and limited liability. We're now reaping the fruits of years and years of underinvestment in companies in order to inflate share prices. And what we're noticing is the limited liability has encouraged levels of debt that mean that many companies will now just collapse. Most companies, because they're lean, mean machines, courtesy of the neoliberal ethic, have got no cash. All they have is a huge pile of debt. And where are the shareholders now? Most of them are being kept out of AGMs because they're asking difficult questions, and it shows that they have no legal rights as far as the business is concerned. Another key assumption is about agency theory, the idea that in order to get workers to behave, you need to manipulate them through incentives and performance management regimes and pay in order to make sure that they are working in the interests of the owners of capital. So why are so many people volunteering, taking salary sacrifices, working harder than ever from their own bedrooms? And why are people being so kind to their neighbours and so helpful and giving all this money to charity if we're all so deeply recalcitrant and flawed? So again, the thinking behind agency theory has been shown in this crisis to be insulting to our humanity. Market pricing is again one of those absolute assumptions of modern capitalism, that the just price is the market price because that is where equilibrium is achieved. What do you do with market pricing in this environment, where suddenly there isn't really any demand and there's not really much supply either? We do see some very strange pricing behaviours, but also we see experiments like in Scotland piloting the universal basic income, and we see ideas coming again to the forefront about the pricing in of externalities as we suddenly enjoy birdsong and clean air, no airplanes and no cars, and the wildlife returning to our gardens and our streets. So all of this leads me back to the word economics, oikonomia, which means the management of the household. And what lockdown has done very beautifully is affected a Copernican revolution in our thinking about economics. I think many children would have drawn a picture of trading desks or marketplaces whenever they were thinking about what capitalism, market economics might mean. But in lockdown, all we have is our household. and our preoccupations are about bread, and flour for baking, and sugar, and toilet paper, and all the things we need to keep the show on the road as a household. And what I'm hoping is that this realization that the household is and always was the basic unit is making the real economy much more real again. The other book I wrote about economics was called Buying God, and it was about consumerism and a theology of consumerism and our job as Christians in the economic environment. And I'd like to finish by saying that I think this is a kairos moment for the churches. We get the economy we deserve. All the economy is messages about supply and demand. Over a matter of months, buying a plastic straw became totally unacceptable just in the last year or so, because people went off the idea of single-use plastic, particularly for something like a drink of Coca-Cola. What could we do coming out of lockdown, going back into whatever world still is there after coronavirus? What can we do to vote our cash in every transaction that we make, so that when we get our bank statements, every single line on there is a vote for the kind of world that we really want, and the kind of world that would make God feel proud?
And look into the future for what might be changed and how Christians and the church could reply and respond to this, and we could start a new era, perhaps, of economics together. Thank you. Now, I would like to ask Dr. Hertel again to continue with his presentation. Please start. Are you with us?
I'm with you. I'm starting the presentation. So I had problems with the sound at the beginning, but I will just repeat where I'm coming from. So I combine, I think, two perspectives here from the academic world, and I give lectures in institutions in Germany and abroad, but also worked in the last 10 years for startups and big corporations all over the world, because I think it's important to know where I'm coming from, that you know my perspective here on this as well, and that I will show a different perspective maybe than Eve. Thank you for your introduction and your keynote. That was great. And I will come more from the perspective of an entrepreneur. So I started also my own business last year, and if you have to understand also how does the economy and others are working, what is the impact on our own businesses, so I can encourage maybe some of you as well as I was encouraged 2 weeks ago. So I think we have one big problem, and that is complexity. So when I'm looking at the television or other channels like internet, reading newspaper, I'm overwhelmed by so many information, by so many opinions. I'm reading what is the mainstream, what happened here, what are the biases, how they're shaped, and when I want to get to the bottom of different topics, I understand and I find out that there are more dependencies and connections, and there are even more information. So I think our problem is not to find information, but to categorize them and to filter them, to understand what are fake news, what is truth, what can be validated. And so for me, it's important to understand this kind of complexity, because once I understood this complexity, I can maybe overcome it and master it. And therefore, I want to introduce a tool which helped me in the past, in the last years, to understand different kind of discussions, discourses, and how they're impacting my business or also your businesses. So like Hans-Joachim said in the beginning also, my bias, or what is my background, is also the St. Gallen management model, and I was influenced by this, and I really like this model, which was like they developed 60 years ago, so 6 decades ago, and they integrated again and again the news management literature, the news trends, and they come up with a new version also in the last 5 years with a fourth generation here. And I want just to give you a short overview that when you're talking about the Sandkalle management model, you're talking often about environmental spheres, in a few seconds about the stakeholder. The stakeholder approach is, I think, very common, but to categorize also the environmental spheres is very specific for the Sandkalle management model. But it's relevant, and it's a relevant reference spaces, because this environment or context will shape or impact the businesses and the other stakeholders. And you have to understand the communication in this kind of discourses to understand what they are talking about. And which is very important, and then what I want to emphasize on is that every sphere has their own language, they have their own coding, they have also their own agenda, they have their own procedures, and they have their own evaluation. So when we're talking about the society, which is like the big one, we can looking at in the last decades about the development. When we're looking at political situation, we can also have like a worldwide comparison, but of course about the political situation in the different countries, because also different countries reacted differently on the coronavirus. Then we have also ethics, science, economy, technology. They have their own education, they have their own words they're using, and also scientific community. They have their own procedures, and they are looking and focusing on different things than maybe politics do. But in these days, it became very important for us to listen to the scientific community, to the politics, because they give us a framework for this. And they're impacting our organization. And when I'm talking about organization, I'm talking about profit and non-profit organization, like churches as well. And so you can apply this model also to churches. And the other point is, and when you're looking about the environmental spheres, it's very tough to get to it, but to understand it, you have to understand the discussions, the discourses. But when you're talking about stakeholders, that's group or individuals. So they're affected by the value or the impact, of course, about the communication of the spheres, but also of your organization. So if your organization is big, they maybe have a big impact, or if they're part of big influencers or others, they also have a big impact. And so you're starting to interact with these stakeholders, and that's good. For example, when you're talking about the government, of course, their organization or association talking to the government and wants to achieve their goals, their procedures. And I would like, of course, emphasize on these topics, and we talked in the last weeks, and we will follow this about the different spheres, and that's good because we have to understand all of them. But I want to put and stop right now at economics. So when we're looking at the economics or at the economy at all, of course, we have also here different models, and that help us to understand what happened in the past and maybe what will happen in the future. And I think every student in the first class of economics know that the economy is coming in kind of phases. And we're talking about 3 or 4 phase approach, that we have like a recovery phase, that we have a boom phase, that we have a recession, and really tough times, we also have a depression. And so when we were like the last financial crisis, in the last phase, we were like in the boom phase. And what was a really long time, especially the German economy did a good job in the last years. And it was just a matter of time since the next crisis or the next the recession phase will came. And the trigger this time was the coronavirus, which is really serious. But we have to understand the different courses here. What does the politicals have on their agenda? What does the scientific community have on their agenda? And so to understand this is really good. But what I missed in this kind of model, and also in the last years, it was another actor or another stakeholder, I would say, and that is God. And I think that's a very important game changer. In this slide, you see God as someone who is outside of the systems. And that's true, because he was the one who created these things. But we know from the Bible, and we know from the history, that with Jesus Christ, he came as a stakeholder itself, also in this kind of context. And so he is very close to us here as well, and is part of the system. And that it's a game changer here as well, because when we're talking about the different kind of things, about the discussions, and it becomes maybe very critical and disappointing, it gets very negative. But when we imagine, and we have different assumptions from a Christian worldview, is when we say, and looking at the Bible, and then we read that let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. And I think that's the kind of framework he's giving us. So he's almighty, he's sovereign. So everything is in place, and he said, no, oops, I did a mistake here, I have to now do something. No, he is the one who establishes authorities. I don't mean with this that we can agree with everything they are doing, and maybe we have a different opinion on this, or we would maybe choose another approach. But from the framework itself is God established this. And I mean, that's a good, and maybe at some point makes you more happy, or can you calm you down. The other point is, and which is different, is God is good to us. And every crisis has, of course, risks, but also opportunities. And what we see is that something new can be created and good come into being. And that's very important to understand, because this is a mindset. How I react in such a crisis as well is that what chance I can take here. And the last one is then also our role and responsibility. According to the Bible, the creative God created humans in his image. And so he put something creative in each of us as well. So we are creative and intelligent and can create something new. And that means that we're not just waiting and looking what's happening, be passive, and that someday maybe we can be proactive. No, we have to analyze, of course, this complexity. But once we understand it, it has an impact of our business, but we can be creative. And that's which I will stop by on my last slide, is that once you understand some of this kind of trends, and that's very interesting, and it's very important for you, that you have this external perspective outside of your business, understanding things. Like when you're looking right now, what's happening? Of course, there are winners and losers of the crisis. So we have big units or big fields and branches like healthcare, hygiene, who are winners, of course. And then we have also big branches which is really losers of this game or this crisis right now, because like the touristic branch, restaurants and others, and they can say, okay, we will stop right now to doing our services, or we say maybe you can change this. And so we using this, and we're starting interactions, we're building relationship, we're asking this kind of different stakeholders, we're asking the politicians, we're asking the scientific community and so on. And then we maybe have to change our business model. And I want to give two examples in the end. One is one of my friend, and he has a 3D printing company. And once he understands that there is some kind of localization, that the supply chains were interrupted, he said, okay, I can come to the companies here in my region, and I can build with the 3D printer maybe some parts which are critical, but they are not getting. So we're talking about localization as well, and security supply chain. And so he came up with other ideas. Another part was in the beginning of the Corona crisis, it must be now 6 or 7 weeks ago, we met with a lot of entrepreneurs, it must be about 60. So the invitation came during the day, and then in the evening we're sitting together, we analyze the trends, we analyze the infection rate, we analyze the different kind of discourses, we're looking how the different stakeholders like World Health Organization, other NGOs are acting, what the politicians are doing, and then we came up with best practice, because already some of us adopted the business model and encouraged us. And I hope also with this model, I can encourage you to understand the complexity, but with like a game changer Jesus, with this positive attitude, starting also be proactive and do something new, something good out of it.
Thank you, Dr. Eugen Hertel, for this inspiring input from an entrepreneur's perspective, because this is, as the English have it, where the rubber meets the road, where our creativity, our intelligence gets into practical life to create businesses, create work, and create wealth, income for the poor. And it's a good, I think, supplement to what Eve just shared with us about the crisis of an capitalism and entrepreneurship run into its extreme without God. That's what I liked about your presentation, bringing in God as a game changer. because we have left him out and forgotten that he was the one who founded the whole thing, and it will only work on the basis of his values. Thank you so much. Now let me give the podium to our last speaker, Professor Prabhu Guptara. Prabhu, why don't you share your thoughts with us? Thank you.
Thank you. Before I start, can I just check with our technical people whether the slide share is working? And if it is, if you could bring the first slide up with the not just the title, but the graphic on it later when I ask you to do so. So my presentation, my thoughts are really on the impact of COVID on economics. Dr. Poole has started us off very interestingly by bringing an ethical, spiritual lens to bear on understanding capitalism as capitalism, market economics as market economics. And Dr. Hertel, of course, has brought a perspective from from an entrepreneur's point of view. So it might be worth asking, following Dr. Hertel, was it time for a recession anyway? Some analysts have been saying for about 3 years that it's been time for a recession. Others have been saying we have actually been in a recession since the last crisis. In other words, we've never been out of a crisis since 2007, because even the artificial floor put under that crisis is now in danger of crumbling. Already unprecedented things were being done since 2007 to keep the economy from going under. And now even more unprecedented things are being done. For example, the line between governments and central banks is being eroded even in those countries which have till now believed in central bank independence. So as these unprecedented things are going on in the global economy, it's worth asking, what is God up to in allowing what's going on? And what is going on anyway? So if I can ask the first slide to be shared, please. That slide raises the question, is our current global lockdown at all comparable to the captivity that the people of Israel went into in Egypt for no fault of their own? And they were there, of course, for a very long time. The records that we have in the Jewish Bible indicate that it was only the Hebrews who were enslaved and oppressed and exploited. Today, what we have around the world is that the whole world has experienced, and much of the world is still experiencing, what it means to be under house arrest. And we are all being oppressed and exploited in different ways. For example, in terms of the wastage of our most precious resource, which is time. It's the only thing we have in life. Money comes and money goes. Time is the only thing we have. And this most precious resource is being wasted as we queue up, for example, for supplies. Why do we have to queue up for supplies? Because they have been made artificially scarce by a coordinated global attempt to whip up mass hysteria and panic. And all the goods that are available now are available at much higher prices than was the case just a few weeks ago. Now, some prices have just begun to fall. My brother-in-law told me that in England today, milk prices have fallen. Butter prices have fallen by 10p a block, which is not an insignificant drop. So the prices of consumer goods being produced inside countries, those prices have started dropping. And this is, of course, a sign that recession is beginning to hit our economies. Demand is dropping to a point where the supply becomes more, and therefore prices have to drop to try to increase sales. Now, what I'm trying to draw your attention to is that economics is always trumped by politics. In other words, economics only has room to play as politics sets the framework in which economics can play. Politics in free societies is a struggle between different interest groups. And the leaders are supposed to judge what is best for society as a whole. That, at least, is a theory. But what have we actually seen since the 1980s? Before I get into that, it might be worth asking, is lockdown captivity perhaps God's way of getting us to lift our eyes first to our true situation as it has been over the last several decades, which we've not wanted to see. Dr. Poole's books, which he was referring to, were published 5 years ago and older, longer ago than that. And there have, of course, been many other books like that, which have tried to open our eyes to the realities around us, but we've not wanted to see those realities either because we were among the winners and did not want to cut off the branch on which we were sitting, or we were hoping to be among the winners. And so we were not interested in looking at what was wrong with the system. We just wanted to win in the system. Could it be that this lockdown captivity is God's way of getting us to say, hey guys, wake up, look at reality? And the second question is this lockdown captivity God's way of getting us to get our eyes lifted up to God so that we can look to him for wisdom and stamina, for being able to work to deliver the world and ourselves from the immediate captivity of the coronavirus, of course, but also from the much worse coronavirus, which has been affecting the global economy since the 1980s. I'm not talking only of people who believe in God. People who don't believe in God can also be working towards this, and many are. And of course, we should be talking to God about them too, so that their wisdom does not fail and their stamina does not fail. So what has been happening since the 1980s? On to my second slide, please, Andreas. This should be a slide about the global class war, a book that was published some years ago by a man called Eve Poole. And there have been, again, many books like this. But what I like about this particular book is that though he takes an American perspective, he is American, he's looking primarily at the American economy, he is not pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. Rather, he's documenting how both parties have been captured by the elites in America and how both parties have together delivered turn by turn. It's not been only a Republican economy these last 40, 50 years. It's not only been a Democrat economy, government, but both parties have delivered the economy to the rich and the super rich. Now, you may say that is Foe's point of view. There are many points of view. Yes, you may disagree with some of the facts he's quoted. Yes. But the brute fact is, as you look at the global economy, that more and more of the world's resources have been captured by fewer and fewer people. That fact cannot be doubted or argued against. I think it was Oxfam that started presenting at the World Economic Forum in Davos some years ago some of the facts and figures that are relevant in this connection. And I remember being quite shocked, it may have been 6 or 7 or possibly 8 years ago, that Oxfam presented that over 1,000, just over 1,000 people, it may have been 1,600 people, owned more than 50% of the world's resources. And I remember being quite shocked at that. 1,600 people owning 50% of the world's resources? Shocking, scandalizing. But the next year, when they presented their figures again, the figure had dropped to something like 600 people in 1 year. And in the year following, it had dropped to something like 300 people. In the year following, it had dropped to something like 100 people. And today, it is a very small handful of people that own more than half the world's resources. So if you disagree with Foe, that's fine. What is your explanation for the fact that fewer and fewer people have come to own more than half the world's resources? Something has been happening. What has been happening? What has been happening is partly, of course, covered by what Dr. Poole was talking about right at the start of our conversation today. And so I won't go into that because she's done it so well. I just want to add that the market fundamentalists that we have today believe that the less that government interferes with the economy, the better. You may remember a certain American president saying, government is not the answer, government is the problem. And that sums up the attitude of market fundamentalists. They would like the markets increasingly to take over as many government functions as possible. So privatize post offices, privatize jails, privatize the army, privatize social security money, put it into stock markets, etc. reduce the role of the state, increase the role of the markets, because of course those markets are under the control of a very few people. So market fundamentalists believe in maximum space for the market, minimum space for the state. Actually, minimum state also for the family, minimum space for the arts, minimum space for education, minimum space for public service media. We can go on, the list goes on. The market is God. Everything else doesn't matter. By contrast, followers of Jesus believe, in fact, anybody who's got his or her senses about them, believes in appropriate space for markets, but no more than appropriate space for markets. Appropriate space for governments, but no more than appropriate space for governments. In other words, there is a proper space that every sphere of human life ought to have, whether it's markets or governments or media or education or religion or arts or entertainment or parents or children or the environment and humanity and so on. All these different aspects of life have their own space, and they ought to be respected, and they ought each to have their own weight. And when any one sector makes a grab for power over the others, imbalance results, captivity results. And God may be in the business of liberating us from that much deeper captivity by bringing upon us this captivity so that we begin to see reality and don't become blind to the fact that market fundamentalists actually love disasters. Why do market fundamentalists love disasters? Because disasters create a clean slate so that the strongest can capture a larger share of resources and a larger share of markets and push their own agenda. Now, by contrast, if you look at today's reality, you can see that trillions of dollars are being spent by our governments. And when you look at what our governments are actually spending their money on, you can see that most of the money is going into banks and big businesses, with as little money as possible going to help the poor and the unemployed and hospitals and the education sector and the art sector and so on, as little as possible. I'm not saying nothing, but as little as possible going into these. But the lion's share is going into protecting and encouraging and feeding big businesses and banks. In fact, we've got a kind of wartime economy around the globe at the moment, with governments directing manufacturers what to produce, critical goods, in order to fill unprecedented and unexpected demand. But the question is, in this wartime kind of economy, to whom are the contracts going? Are the contracts going to the best companies, or are the contracts going to the companies owned by cronies close to leaders in government? I'm sure there are some countries where contracts are in fact going to the best companies. But I'm also sure that there are many countries around the world where contracts are going to cronies of the government, of the leaders of the government. So that's interesting and worth watching. And this may be one of the things that God wants to open our eyes to. Andreas, could we go on to my next slide? My next slide should show you a website in relation to a book titled Shock Doctrine by an author, Naomi Klein. And this book is a very interesting book because it documents, it gives examples of how disasters, both natural disasters and organized disasters, are being used to hand resources and markets over to corporations and elites. Two examples she gives of man-made disasters and two examples of natural disasters, which I'm picking up for illustration here. The first human organized disaster was Iraq's civil war, during which a new law was created that would allow two companies, Shell and BP, to claim the country's vast oil reserves. Second human organized disaster, September the 11th, in response to which the Bush government handed over the running of their so-called war on terror to two companies, Halliburton and Blackwater. Natural disasters. Well, the tsunami wiped out, you may remember, large parts of Southeast Asia. And what happened? The pristine beaches were auctioned off to the rich, to become tourist resorts. So poor people can't access those beaches now. You may remember the disaster in New Orleans, the Hurricane Katrina. Well, when the residents of New Orleans, recovering from Hurricane Katrina, got back to something like life, which was more or less normal, they were shocked to discover that their public housing, their hospitals, and their schools would not be reopened. Now, it could be, of course, that in the current situation with the coronavirus and governments having to struggle to maintain their own popularity, there may, as public opinion turns against the handing over of resources to the rich, and as the game that has been played over the last so many decades becomes transparent to people, and people suffer the consequences of it themselves, it may be that people become unwilling to tolerate that sort of thing going forward. And so governments are, of course, terrified of what will happen if there's a popular revolt against this going on. And so they will no doubt do what they can to improve things on the ground for people, which will be excellent. But that brings me to the question of what is going to happen once the COVID disaster begins to pass, as it is in fact just beginning to pass, and as lockdowns begin to be lifted, as they're just beginning to be lifted in many countries. Well, what's going to face us as a global economy and as national economies is the choice between continuing the way the economy was before, in which a few people continued to gather all the assets, and big companies became bigger companies by acquiring smaller companies and becoming, in fact, oligopolies, a few companies controlling that particular sector of the economy. Whether we're going to allow that to continue, or whether we're going to work towards making the economy something that is good for the whole of humanity, for all the citizens of a country. That is the fundamental choice facing us as we go forward from COVID. So I think this is a challenge for anybody of goodwill, whether they are believers in Jesus or Muslims or Jains or Hindus or atheists or whatever. It's a challenge for people of goodwill to decide which side of the battle they are going to line up on. Because make no doubt about it, it is in fact going to be a big struggle between these two competing visions of what an economy should be and what politics should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prabhu, for this insightful analysis of the situation and for bringing us into your thoughts and the view of the world. Thank you also to all of you who have contributed by asking questions or giving comments in the chat rooms. I have received some of the feedback and the questions, and we'll try to present them as they are directed to the one or the other of our speakers. Like the Rock is asking, happy family, okay, but can we do that without standing up and starting to influence political and economic decisions making on a national level? While Eve's points are valid, what are valid alternatives? Is there anything you would like to reply, Dr. Poole?
Could you just read out the beginning of that again?
Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover teaches me how to take stewardship of my income. Coupled with prayer and discipleship, churches can transform the economy by reforming how we understand money. Can we do that without standing up and starting to influence political and economic decisions making on a national level? What are valid alternatives? Can the church influence the understanding of money and family?
Well, I suppose my view is that any act is a political act in very many ways. So I think it depends what you're up to, rather than getting party political about it. It is about the polis, it's about the Commonwealth and how we want to behave together as a community. So my notion, my realization, I suppose, is that because we are the economy and we get the economy we deserve, we can change that anytime we like. The assumption has been that we need politicians to change it through regulation. But because we know much more now than we used to about complex adaptive systems, we now know the fastest way to change a system of this complexity is through consumer nudges. So I mentioned the example of plastic straws, which have just become anathema really very quickly. In the UK and elsewhere in the world, fair trade as a category in the supermarkets, particularly starting with coffee, was created really quite quickly by Christians choosing to overpay to provide a premium to fair trade producers. So I think half of the bananas bought in supermarkets these days are fair trade. That's a whole new category that was created by Christian spending decisions. So my challenge is this: what more could we do? Which other categories could we create that may not even have been created yet, by just noticing where we need to be voting our spend, our market messages, in solidarity with the people who don't have voices because they have no money themselves to change the market to be in their own image. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. Can I add, in your understanding, Eve, is taking responsibility and implementing the values that I have grown up with and that I have learned from the Bible as a Christian, implementing them on an individual and on a group level in society consciously is a key issue.
Absolutely. The one thing that separates us from the angels is that we have free will. Angels are not free to choose to sin, but we can choose to sin if we wish to. And that means we should relentlessly choose to behave well. And that means everything that you have learned about how to behave and how to choose needs to be deployed every day, but particularly in situations of moral peril like the corona crisis. So for me, it is about trying to take seriously the way that crowd behaviours are created. And they're only ever created by a few individuals being fed up enough to start behaving differently. And that becomes as contagious as any virus. And any movement in the world that you can think of was started by a few people who refused to give up. And that's what I'd ask us all to do now, is just to refuse to give up and give in to a system which we knew was broken anyway and is even more so obviously broken now.
Thank you for this hopeful, inspiring challenge that you pass over to us and to the one who asked the question. I have here Jingdae Kim Lungdim, if I pronounce the name right. He's asking the question, does it mean capitalism is all good and socialism is bad? Why can't we have a balanced combination of both? Anyone of the panelists would like to respond to this?
I'm very happy to. I think the whole thing is a continuum, really, about intervention. I think what you have, as Prabhu has said, is a political and legal context in which transactions take place. And different geographies and different states make choices about who owns what. Increasingly around most of the world now, there is private ownership of assets, and that drives a sort of capitalism, however you construct it. And then it's about how many of the messages that go into the market are left to be invisible hand free market messages, and how many of them are interventions by the government. And what we're seeing at the moment is that there's no such thing as a free market economy anywhere in the world. There is always an amount of socialism in that there is an amount of government action. And the project for every state is to figure out what is the correct balance for their geography and their time and their situation. At the moment, we're seeing a wholesale move towards socialism because that's the only way to cope in a crisis of this magnitude. The question will be, where does that settle when some of the vehicles, the routines of free markets start being able to function again? But they could never do so without the state's help, and I think that's a lesson we're learning rather quickly.
Being German, I allow myself to add that the model that was created in Germany after World War II, the so-called social market economy, in my eyes, is an ideal combination of both, where state responsibility, free entrepreneurship, responsibility for the weak was combined in a legal and economic system that really functioned well and was probably the structural reason for the great success of Germany in these past decades. We are now losing these foundations, but that's a topic of its own. Just to answer the question, I have another question here from Binto John, which is provocative. It aims at Dr. Eugen Hertel's statement that governments are ordained by God. He asks, God appointed Hitler as an authority, and the Allies were in rebellion against God in trying to defeat him. Again, one-size-fits-all theology. I think it may be good to clarify a little bit on this issue of God ordaining governments. Would you like to reply something to this question?
Yes, sure. I think we have to be very careful to say at some points that Hitler or they can abuse this kind of things, and we can also go back in history and where people in the name of God did things. And also here I would like to give it a framework and say what are the beliefs and the value behind this. And when we're talking about God, or I bring into the game here Jesus, is that we talking about specific people in this or persons we believe in. We're talking about the belief. Then, of course, and what I see also in church history is that from this 12 disciples became a large organization. And we see it often when we're starting with a good vision or with a good aim, and it's becoming very professional and big, that we're coming into dependencies. And that, of course, also some kind of truth is mixing with some of the hidden agenda. And here it's the same, where, of course, like I said, is that he's established, he is someone who gives a framework, but he's not maybe also agreeing on the things they did. And sometimes also what we're calling, that's a one point, I think, that we're talking about belief, then we can talk also about theology, and then also how we can separate this. And the other is more on the pragmatic side as well as then also the context, what the people do with them with the power. And the other point is what is good for us. And so we said, of course, and I don't want, especially with my German history, that what Hitler did is worse, and it's very dramatic. But what happened in this kind of, I want to go back and say, okay, what positives happening here? What positive in this case, that something new was born. People came out with innovative things again. And in this case also then we said, okay, yes, he put it in power, but he was not someone who were not with the people then and said, okay, I will be abandoned now and you can do what you want from both sides. He was there and with the suffering people. There were Christians around who helped these people. So I think we have to put it in a more holistic way and differentiate it a bit more. I hope that answers this kind of question.
Would any one of you like to add anything? Prabhu, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I would like to just respond to Bintu John's question in the following way. God ordains governments, but, as the Bible says, but it says that these governments are ordained for a moral, ethical, and social purpose, as well as an economic purpose. That is the flourishing of the people. And if the leaders do not do that, then they themselves come into judgment. Because in the way of thinking that there is in the Bible, as distinct from the Quran, as distinct from the Gita, as distinct from the Vedas, as distinct from the Buddhist scriptures and so on, the way of thinking that there is in the Bible says that he or she who is in a position of responsibility has the greater consequence of doing good things as well as bad things, not only in terms of their people, but also for themselves. So if a leader sinned, for example, did something that was morally wrong, they were punished much more than the ordinary person was. If the ordinary person did something wrong, he or she paid a fine of, let's say, 1 rupee or 1 pound or 1 yen or $1. But if the leader did something wrong, he or she had to pay a fine of $7 or $10 or yen or whatever. So there was a principle of differential punishment based on your position in society, recognizing the fact that you were a leader, you had greater knowledge, you had greater wisdom, you had greater power. And because of that, if you still do wrong things, that has a greater consequence. And therefore, you should pay a bigger price for having done something wrong. That is the full orb of biblical thinking. It's not just the one point that we blindly follow whoever is in government. And this is the great thing about democratic governments, that democratic governments can hold leaders to account much more than tyrannical governments, than dictatorial governments. And dictatorial governments might last 70 years, 700 years, God knows in history they've lasted very long times. But the great thing about democratic governments is that you can discipline your leaders at least every 5 years, unless, of course, you're a direct democracy, in which case your great leaders are not that great anyway, because the real power is with the people. But in most countries, the real power is not with the people, it's with the leaders. And that is why it's so important to have the right kind of leaders and for leaders to do the right kinds of things. And if the leaders do the right kinds of things, then there is a duty of civil disobedience, which Paul also makes clear. And the Germans, in fact, many of the German Christians did civilly and uncivilly disobey. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is an outstanding example of a man who opposed Hitler, first in a civil way, peacefully, and then actually entered a bomb plot to kill Hitler, because he felt things had gone so far that nobody could tolerate a man like Hitler any longer. So there have been many examples of civil disobedience, and there have been many examples of uncivil disobedience by people of goodwill, not only Christians, of course, but people of goodwill of all sorts.
Thank you, Prabhu, for this helpful and insightful, enlightening comment. I have another question from Pat about money and food and hunger. What I mean is we need more than understanding money. I think we might not need money anyway. We need to understand the basic need of humanity first, which is food and love. With current condition, famine might happen, especially in the city. And if church is not smart about working with agricultural sector, people might not survive. That's definitely a perspective from countries that are not so well off as the Western world. Who would like to reply to that?
I can certainly start. I think it's about what money is and what it's for. And of course, it's for buying food, buying clothing, buying housing. And it's only when you are able to progress from some kind of swapping barter economy that money becomes relevant, because it's a way of reckoning comparative values. And it's a more convenient way of being able to trade access between parties. So I think, as I said, oikonomia, the economy of the household, is at the moment showing the reality of that, which is actually we don't necessarily need very much at the moment when we're just at home, but we do absolutely need shelter and food and heating. And it is becoming very clear all over the world that where there are people who don't have that, there is no point to money for them. And that's where the churches are crucially important as anybody of good faith, and why it is so heartening to see neighbourhoods coming together to spot that kind of problem on their doorstep, to notice if people haven't been seen, if no deliveries have been made, in order to make sure there aren't people locked away dying. And also that the homeless are housed, and that those who are incarcerated, those who are in want, do get some help. And I think that's why there has been so much intervention by governments across the world to focus on those basics, because if they don't, there will be incredible levels of social unrest, because it's becoming very clear to people in this lockdown situation the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And it does put money back in its place, as you say.
Well, did you want to add anything? You were raising your hand a while ago.
Prabhu, yes. Well, I was raising my hand only because I'm from that part of the world anyway, which is historically deprived and is even currently deprived. And the sad thing in many third world countries, many so-called developing countries, two-thirds world countries, is that the situation is being taken as an excuse to really lock the poor out even more and to dispossess the poor even more than was the case earlier. So as governments arrogate to themselves, draw to themselves, gather to themselves more and more power, they use this power against the people. And this is really very tragic. So in India, for example, we have seen the state being panicked into stopping the movement of people by shutting state boundaries. India has many different states, of course, like America. And so these state boundaries were shut. And the result was that migrant labor, people migrate hundreds, some thousands of miles to work in cities or in factories. And of course, when the work collapsed because of coronavirus, they were out of work. And they did not have a good social network with any possibilities to support them in reality. So they wanted to get back to their villages and to their homes, hundreds of miles away, without any resources. They couldn't fly, they couldn't pay for bus travel and train travel. So they were cycling and they were walking hundreds of kilometers to get to their homes. And of course, the state boundaries were shut. And so hundreds of thousands of people were stopped at these state borders. Why? Just to protect the people in power from the anger of the people if the disease spread. So the situation is actually terrible in countries like India, where the poor are starving, but of course the press is not allowed to bring news of this out into the public. And so there are doctored facts that are just beginning to appear here and there. But when the true scale of the disaster begins to become apparent, then we will see how bad the situation has actually been as a result of coronavirus in some of our countries, where close living together in slums means, of course, that the disease will spread in a way that it need not spread in middle-class neighborhoods where people are living in their own homes, 2 or 3 at a time.
Another big challenge for the church to step in and look for new responsibilities and opportunities to serve the poor and bring in new values. But that is a tremendous challenge. Well, there's another question by German-Austrian Wolfgang Baske, a futurist researcher. Will we experience a sectoral shift back to traditional sectors like agriculture and to modern sectors like information technology? Will we experience a sectoral shift back to traditional sectors?
Maybe I can start or grab this question. So I think at some points, yes, just to secure the supply chain and from a point of risk management. But I think on the other way, we see also, especially when we look at technology, that a crisis like Corona give a boost into this digitalization. So I was in this digitalization sector branches for years, and we have to convince the people. But now in different sectors like telecommunication, they don't see any other option right now. So I think it will be changing a bit for a security reason. Of course, we're coming back to things, and we see also when we have a lockdown or when borders are closed that we don't get the things we need, that at some points we will find other ways or we'll do again. But I think just for a specific point, but we don't see I see even a boost in modern technology, IT, and this kind of. And in the last days, we talked also about globalization and deglobalization. I don't see really in specific areas a deglobalization. It must be more differentiated. In some pieces, yes, of course, and that goes in the same direction here, where we still will use global resources and resourcing, especially in combination with technology. But yes, I also agree and say we could go more locally, but I have seen also this trend before. Yeah.
Thank you. Prabhu, you want to say something? Or no?
I agree with Eugen on something. Sorry, I agree with Eugen on some things, but I think that the impact of globalization, even in IT, is going to be limited by nationalist tendencies. So we can already see this in China. China has drawn a sort of electronic curtain around itself, which is trying to expand to take in more and more countries. And this electronic bubble, which is a Chinese electronic bubble, is different from the global electronic bubble. which is, of course, mostly run out of the United States, but not only. So we see ahead of us a kind of clash between the Chinese view or the Chinese way of organizing IT and the, shall we call it, the global way of organizing IT. And as countries want to bring manufacturing back into their own countries now, because long supply chains are affected by the kinds of problems, not only that we have at present with coronavirus, but terrorist threats and natural disasters of other sorts, most countries are wanting to bring manufacturing back into their own countries. And most manufacturing is, of course, IT-led. And so there will, I think, emerge more and more national or regional models of IT and manufacture coming together, which are different from the models that we have in other countries. So up to now, we've had a global tendency in IT, which the Chinese particularly have fought against, and they're big enough to fight against it. And now I think we will find the Europeans wanting to do their own thing, and possibly Africans wanting to do their own thing, India certainly wanting to do its own thing, and so on. So I think globalization will even affect the IT sector, but it will certainly affect manufacture, the manufacturing sector, which will see a revival in the Western countries. So over the last 40, 50 years, we've seen a decline of manufacturing in the West. I think we will see a revival of manufacturing in the West. We've seen a decline of agriculture in the West. And I think we will see a revival of agriculture in the West, in developing countries as well. But not just here, of course. We will find that commodity prices around the world will be affected by the new developments in economics, in global economics, which are going to take place, which will emphasize the national economy rather than global economies, much to the disadvantage of many countries in the third world.
Yeah, I just want to add one point, and I totally agree with you, because the model itself is changing, because the setup is changing, the framing is changing, and of course then business models which were not attractive for the last years become attractive again, and so we have to adapt it. And then, because it doesn't make sense to get some parts because it was just a few pennies, but now the people say, I cannot sell this machine, now I'm willing to pay $500 to get something from the 3D print. So that's also how we're adapting with the new environment, with the new trades or with the new changes, our models. And I totally agree with you.
So very specifically, the change that has happened is that we moved from mass manufacturing. I'm not saying it has stopped, that is still going on, but we have moved from mere mass manufacturing to the possibility of manufacturing for one. And you were mentioning, Eugen, that your friend who's in 3D printing, he is a very good example of manufacturing for one. But that can also be scaled up, of course. So the Chinese are now manufacturing 10 houses a day, 3D printed, 10 houses a day and building them.
Yeah.
So we can have manufacturing for one, we can have manufacturing for small batches, and we can have manufacturing for big batches as well as for the mass market. And what it means is that we don't need to have the kind of scale, we don't need to have the kind of scale that we did earlier. It's still possible to have the scale. We don't need to have the kind of scale. So very small countries can manufacture for themselves by isolating themselves from the global market, which was not possible earlier because, of course, mass manufacturing meant economies of scale. And so you could flood the market with very cheap products. But if you have legislative barriers preventing these cheap products from coming in, and at the same time you have your own country products from your own country which are relatively cheap, then of course it becomes possible to build national economies as well. And that will be very interesting to watch going forward, what is going to happen to the swing between globalization and deglobalization.
Thank you. I think we should leave this now. Enough has been said. There was an earlier question by Richard Stevenson, who or what are markets? Relating to, you all talked about markets. Would anyone like to reply to this question of Richard Stevenson?
That's for Eve.
I think it just depends how complex you want to be. Any sort of exchange is really a market. What we think of as markets is quite a sophisticated version of, you know, the old-fashioned agora marketplace of sort of ancient Greece and Rome. eBay is one of the purest markets where people who have things they want to get rid of advertise them, and potential customers bid for the right to buy. That's an example of a very sort of modern type of market. So it depends really scale and complexity. But wherever you are in the world, the most remote beach, you will find a child who wants to sell you something because in getting some currency from you or swapping for some item you have that they would like, they can then take that currency or that item and trade it for something else that they need. So ever since people had to live with other people and found that they were better at something than someone else or had more of something than someone else, we've traded. It's a very basic human instinct. And now we have incredible complexity with automated trading and tertiary fractional trading on the most infinitesimal blink of an eye, changes in price on the markets. But we also still have farmers markets on the weekends pre-lockdown, where people bring their goods to market in the way that they have done so since time began. So I've got a very basic understanding of markets, but I appreciate, again, it's a scale of complexity.
Thank you. I think we should turn to the next question. Barbara Dux is asking, how do we respond in a world controlled by financial elites and those who control the wealth, especially if there's no shared morality? Who would like to reply to this?
I wrote about this a lot in my book because I think there is a danger that we do lose control, particularly with automated trading, because that's all algorithm driven. And if the algorithms are driven by utilitarian ethic, then it is a morality of sorts. But as we've seen, it's a calculation about upside. So I'm really worried about that. I'm really worried about how out of control the capital markets were in particular, and how difficult it will be to row back from that, which is why I'm in favour of intervention, things like transaction taxes, the Robin Hood taxes on transactions, to try and slow some of that down. Because as we've seen from flash crashes and all of these very famous events, it's incredibly dangerous, how out of control the financial markets are in particular.
I would just add and say how we can change this. I think we made some mistakes years ago, and it's starting by the education, our business schools, where we have like some subjects like ethics, and the professors itself don't really know what they do with this topic, because it's really driven by price, it's by profitability. So I think we have to start in our education again, and using such crisis, we can talk again about ethics, but also about values and impact on these values. And it will take years to get there, because the students who will be now in the university talk about this will be the next leadership in 20 or 30 years, so it will take time. And the other point is we can come up also with innovative models, and I've seen this also especially in the financing sector or banking, where little startups coming up with new also models where they like making transactions that you don't have to pay for others. So here you also have an access where you can get and say, okay, with a very innovative model, we can ask about the basis of this financial institution and so on. And of course, when we're talking about the spheres and the stakeholders again, we can also have a discourse again from the politicians, because they're giving the framework. But here also again the balance. How much does the government influences and has to go in, and how much they can regulate on their own. But of course then, so I would say we have to start much earlier in education, business schools, where we can shape the people's minds, where we can give them also very successful models and say, okay, don't think about short term, don't think about long term. What does it mean when you're doing business like this now, and what does it mean for the next 30 years or next 40 years? And if they maybe starting and go more strategically and see what's happening in the future, maybe they stop and maybe they come in with a new mindset. And we see this also with a new generation. When we're talking about the different generations, I think also the new generation which is coming in, they're thinking more about values. They're thinking about why I should do my work. Why is this and this? So they're asking a lot of questions, and I think that's good, and they're more critical in this kind of things. So you should start at the education part, and maybe we will talk about this also next or the week after.
Thank you all. I have many more questions than we can address. It's so good that you participate. Clint Humphrey asks, with the prospect of persecution of Christians and exclusion of the poor from financial systems, should Christians focus on developing alternative financial systems, for instance, blockchain, Bitcoin, etc.? Who would like to reply?
I think it's always very tempting to imagine that there is a better, an alternative system, I suppose. I wrote my book not because I'm trying to destroy capitalism, because I think capitalism is a very good system. It's just a system that is currently broken and needs fixing. You particularly see that where people don't use traditional markets. So all the countries where there are grey markets, there are black markets, whenever you see that, you know that the formal market is broken. And you particularly see it where people aren't able to engage in markets. This is why there has been so much tension in international development around transactions. I know in India, in many of the slums, it's about trying to make sure that even if people don't have an address and a bank account, they have a phone, which could be a platform for transactions so they can participate in a market. And why Bill Gates is trying to get computers out to people, because if you can't get online, that also now excludes you from so many markets. So for me, the attention is about trying to get everyone able to play in the global marketplace, because the market is not in itself bad or good. It is whatever we make it through our transactions. And what has happened to the market globally is it's become corrupt because it has been colonized by the powerful. And we can fight back because we also have votes in the market. Every transaction we make also counts. But it's trying to mobilize the collective muscle of the very many Christians and people of faith around the world who do have wealth to be acting in solidarity with those who are not yet able to participate, so that their voices are heard until they themselves can participate in the markets in their own right.
Thank you. Prabhu, you want to add?
Just to add, Eve is absolutely on the spot as usual with her comments. I would only just like to add that the issue is sometimes a little bit wider than just Christians. Christians should, of course, do whatever they should do, but it's good for Christians to realize that there are many people who are not Christians, Hindus like myself, Muslims, Jews, atheists, agnostics, Marxists, whoever. Anybody of goodwill who is trying to do the right things must be worked with and engaged with and joined hands with in the fight for the good. And the Bible is absolutely clear about that. I do not understand the kind of Christianity which we have around the world today, which is focused on Christians, 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 and Christians. God is not interested only in Christians. God is interested in humanity. And the interesting point in God's attitudes is that he has no favorites. And I'm quoting the Bible. God has no favorites. God treats everybody according to their actions and what has motivated them. There are many people who claim to be Christians who may be very far from God. And there may be many people who are not Christians at all, maybe very anti-Christian, who are in fact very much closer to God than many Christians. So let's forget these labels business and let's stop being concerned about Christians or others. Let's join with everybody of goodwill and let's try to find the right things to do. And as Eugen was saying earlier, let's see what we can do positively in terms of being creative, in terms of adding wealth, in terms of working for humanity and releasing people who are being oppressed by our systems. And that really is what makes the difference between a positive approach to everybody and a very limited and narrow approach.
Thank you, Prabhu. We are getting closer to the end of our session. There's one question that has been introduced by comments of Vishal. The question is raised by Michael Hellquist in the invitation questions. Is coronavirus the global war number 3 that is summoning the Chinese century? And perhaps Vishal should respond to that.
Thank you. Okay. I'm in America right now. I should have been in Africa, but thanks to coronavirus. So watching the American news here and there, it is interesting that American media is even using the phrase the Chinese century. And as I see it, President Trump's team has definitely taken on China as the enemy that it will be fighting for the next 6 months until November 3rd, the election day, just as in 2016, Islam and illegal immigration were the issues on which President Trump came to power. So the rhetoric will definitely increase as China is the villain. But what that admits is that China has been becoming powerful. 20 years ago, we would have been talking about Japan competing with American business and economy. But now it is China competing with American business and economy. So I mentioned this Atlantic article by George Becker, which has been published last weekend in Germany as well, that America has been a failed state. What the coronavirus has done is exposed the failure. Now, those are issues that I need to understand more. If, on the one hand, you have the country, the USA, this was the American century, if that is perceived as a failed state and it itself is perceiving China as the growing power, that is an international context, whether the motivation is that, yes, the Chinese invented the virus and sent it out to the world, or that this gives us an opportunity to stop repaying the debt that we owe. But if China is no longer lending, but it keeps creating the wealth, how will countries that have become addicted to living off debt, how will they keep their economies going if you are increasing $1 trillion, $2 trillion debt every year and you are no longer repaying the debts to China? Means that China is no longer lending to you. Everyone else is afraid to lend to you. So it is a question that is, I mean, there's nothing wrong in China or India becoming the dominant powers of the next 100 years or less or more. But a revival, a new awakening, a renewal of the West is certainly what coronavirus is asking us to pray for and work for.
Well, thank you. Mm-hmm. Anyone else of the panelists would like to add?
Just a revival. It's not just a revival of the West. It's a revival of the globe that is being looked for, a renewal of humane values around the world. America may start it, England may start it, India may start it, China may start it. But what we really need is a revival of humane values: liberty, equality, fraternity, humility, modesty, service, love. These are the values that need to be, revived around the world, and not just the value of greed and money and I and me and my, which have been the ruling values for the last 40, 50 years in the West. But not only the West, of course.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely correct. What I've taken from today's conversation is that you have the economic sphere, the market, and you have the political sphere, and this is where the power is. But the economy, free market economy, works best when the overall social context has moral capital and moral boundaries. So marginalization of Christianity in the West has broken down the boundaries. So if in the beginning you believed that you shall not covet is God's moral demand, that we shall not covet, but economy changes or capitalism changes to greed is good, you shall covet, then you have a real problem, because you still have the same economy which assumes that there is an invisible hand, but there is more than one invisible hand. Traditionally, there are two invisible hands. Whether this is work of God or work of the devil, coronavirus, you have more than one invisible hand. The question is, how are we going to restore that moral capital which has disappeared? So the pulpit is no longer shaping the moral values of the players in the fields, in the factories, in the business, in industry, that it needs to shape. And that is what is, that market must have its place, but it must operate within the framework of light of God's moral standards, rather than the darkness of greed and covetousness. That's, I think, the important point that I'm taking from what the panelists have said today.
Thank you, Vishal, for this excellent summary and spiritual orientation that is certainly leading us into the series of the next talks and discussions that will follow. And we cannot answer all of these questions today, but they are meant to stimulate our thinking, our prayers, and our cooperation with others. So I invite you all and your friends and others, new ones that you could think of, to join us next week at the same time, 4 p.m. Central European Time, for the next session, which will be on society. I will be sharing this session again with 2 German speakers and 1 British, as far as I know, maybe changes. And thank you all for listening. Let me end with a brief talk to God, who we thank for what has happened today. Thank you, dear Father God, who created this universe and created our minds and our intelligence and our creativity to not be frustrated and resign in face of problems, but to start using our God-given capital and gifts and intelligence to work on solutions and to overcome borders and limitations, and to reach out to our fellow humans in love, respect, truthfulness, grace, in all these good values and attitudes that you have given to us in your writings. Thank you that you send us out into this world to serve, not to exercise dominion, but to build and to bless and to do good. We ask that out of this talk today, there will be blessing and good as a result. We pray in Jesus' name.
Amen.
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 Thank you all again for joining us, and hopefully again next week at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.